Hi, I'm here with a summary of week one and really trying to give more direction and answer some of the questions that are coming up. I can't answer all of the questions, that would take quite a bit longer than I want you to stay on this video, but I do want to say some things that are important. But before we get into that topic, I'd like to talk a little bit about your responses. So one of the things that we're trying to get you to do is to not just summarize what you've read and seen, although that's important, but really talk about the thoughts, about what you're seeing around you that's happening for real, what are the things that you're questioning, and what are things that make you critical about RTI? Because RTI is happening all around us, it's part of the law, and therefore it's necessary, but at the same time, we as outside and inside observer can be critical about what's actually happening in schools. And a lot of you have made that comment that while theoretically we need this many minutes and every day and things like that, which works when you're working in an elementary school, once you move into secondary environments, whether it's middle school or high school, it becomes a lot tougher to have these things happen on a daily basis and at the same amount. And the same thing goes for the structures that are required. The first question that I want to talk about is a question that Mary actually brought up. And she talked about the fact that while there's a percentage that is optimal based on RTI assumptions, you might be working in a school that has a lot more students who are struggling to make things happen. And she talks specifically about school with high poverty, high problems, a lot more than 15% of students are struggling, and therefore there's a need for much more response to intervention in the structure, and those classic percentages don't work. And I have two responses to that. One is a historical response, and the other one is really a practical response to a great degree. The historical response is that when RTI was thought out in the early 90s and designed, it was not designed with the idea of using national standards to identify those 15, 25%, whatever it is that you define, but actually it was done with the idea of identifying the bottom 15% in the school. Even if the school as a whole is struggling, you're still intervening with the bottom 15%. And the logic of this is what carries us to today. And that is, if you have 50% or 40% that are not making it, it's really not a problem for intervention. It's really a problem for that tier one excellent delivery of instruction that needs to be treated. So the idea is that if you've got such huge numbers or percentages, really, you are dealing with a totally different problem that happens at the whole school, or at least at the classroom level, and not at the let's take care of a few students level. So that's part of the response. I know it doesn't answer all of the questions around that, but that's at least the thinking that it comes with. There was a question about Tier 3. Is Tier 3 really special education or not? Originally, Tier 3, again, going back historically, was thought of as special education. That is, if students are in response to intervention, they're not responding repeatedly, we increased intensity, still nothing, it really serves as identification for special education without additional diagnostic tests. That's basically a system that evolved out of the criticism of the different formulas and diagnostic tests that were not necessarily any better than the idea of response to intervention. That has, however, changed in most districts, and actually many of the districts have 3 tiers. First, and then special education. So it's an adaptation of part of it with the recognition that you need to do something else to identify kids for special education. Again, you don't have to. RTI should be enough. The failure to respond to intervention should be enough for placing students and enable them to get services, mostly because what we've learned throughout the year that labels do not really help identify what intervention students need in special education, and we've changed to categories of need instead of categories of diagnosis. That being said, we seem to be very attached to labels. We seem to take great comfort in them, and we have evidence that about 50% of kids actually benefit from having a label. The problem is the other 50% do not at all benefit from having a label. So this is a coin toss, really. Most of the knowledge about RTI comes from elementary, and that's where it's been done most successfully and most thoroughly. Middle schools and high schools are still really struggling with concepts how to do it. Most middle schools and high schools that I know do it every other day, not every day, and they create special classes where they channel those students. The problem is that those students then are losing their choice classes, their electives, and that can create disengagement. So there's a need to manage some of that in smarter ways, but that's part of this. There was a question about the pushback. And when we talk about the pushback and teachers not wanting to come aboard, first of all, there has to be a recognition that something like response to intervention is a school-wide system. This is not something you do just in your classroom or somewhere else. If it's not systematic throughout the school, it really doesn't exist. I mean, you can use interventions, but it's not response to intervention as such. If you have teachers that respond or don't come on board, Gasky really talks about this and says, instead of trying to convince teachers to do something in a new way based on evidence or based on internal belief, sometimes what you need to do is just force the case and say, let's try this. And then based on the outcomes, when they are positive, teachers will come aboard. So it's a question of what do you do first? And he says sometimes you gotta just go for it, tell them to trust you, tell them to try, and then evaluate the results. And if the results are positives, they'll be on board. If the results are not positive, then who wants to be on board is a real question. So that's another topic that really needs to be addressed. One thing that was discussed and I think is important to talk about is how long do you wait before you decide that students are not responding to intervention? And here, especially in reading, it's very important to distinguish between some basic skills, and I include in that phonemic awareness, phonics and the alphabetic principles, even some orthographic principles, even fluency. Tend to respond very well to intervention, very quickly to intervention within weeks. So if you're not getting anything within weeks, probably not doing well. But if you move to vocabulary and comprehension, the most critical of the reading skills, we don't actually know how long it takes, but we do know that it takes considerably longer than weeks to really grow in those areas in a way that's measurable and sensitive to our instrument. And so when we intervene with those basic skills, the first three, phonemic awareness, phonics, fluency, we're perfectly fine. We can assume that there will be reaction fairly quickly, and if there wasn't, there's nothing going on. But in comprehension, strategies, in vocabulary, and all the strategies that go around that, growth will be much slower, much harder to tap. So we need a lot more patience. So just to sum up what I talked about today, and really what I want you to do, is I want to make sure that you're making progress. The conversations have been wonderful, and I want you to keep on having the conversations where you infuse your own experiences and learn from others, ask questions, and please, 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 if you have questions that are addressed to you, try and answer them. Because this is what keeps this alive, and this is what makes this just as good as, if not better, than a face-to-face class. So keep on staying engaged, keep on doing the work, and if you have any specific questions, concerns, or things that are not working for you, don't hesitate to send me an email, and I will try to respond to you as quickly as I can, or somebody else will. So I'll see you next week.